If you'd actually like to pull up the slide deck now, we can go through it. Thank you. All right. As we have me break that up. 2 seconds.
I think it should be up. Do people see it?
I don't.
I
Oh,
just see a black screen.
oh,
Yeah, we see a black screen as well.
I also currently see just the black screen.
oh. Janine, will you try sharing? It worked earlier. Sorry about that, everyone. I'll stop.
Ming, I see you sent me the presentation as a PDF. Should I just use that, or do we have an actual slide show?
Yeah, will you use the PDF?
All right. Did you stop the recording or is it still on?
Oh,
The
yeah.
recording is still on. I can stop
Okay,
it and start it though.
We'll probably edit out this.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no,
We'll edit
that's
out this
fine.
part.
But while y'all are still pulling up the slide deck, I guess I can get started and then we can go through the slides afterwards and skip through them. So for those that are in the room, welcome to today's workshop. We are Q Latinx, and today's discussion is going to be speaking on the unique experiences and challenges faced by our LGBTQ neurodivergent youth. The idea is to be able to have an aim to foster not only understanding, sharing resources, and creating more of an inclusive environment for all. And I feel like those are some of the things that a lot of folks mentioned when we were going through what we wanted to talk about today, or what we wanted to learn. To give a little bit background of who Q Latinx is and what we do, we are a grassroots organization in the Central Florida area that works with those that sit at the intersection of LGBTQ and Latinx. We are a racial, social, gender justice organization that's dedicated to the empowerment and advancement of our local LGBTQ Latinx community. One of the things that we always do before we get started in a conversation is we go through a community agreement. Once they pull the slide deck up, we'll be able to go through that a little bit further.
Would you like me to give it a shot and see if I can share it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, give me just a moment.
I think, Janine, you'll have to make John a
Can you all
co-host.
see that?
We sure can.
Oh, wonderful. All right.
All right.
So let me. So here are our community agreement. Oh, it's running fast. There we go. So these are the community agreements. Are we able to see that clearly, or do I need to? That should be better, right?
Yeah, we
Yeah.
can see.
Okay. So Gabriella?
Yes, so these are community agreements that we go through in usually a lot of our workshops that we have, and that's just to build a foundation for the conversation that we're going to have, and just so that we have a consensus from the room, because we're going to have some deep conversations. I know that there's some discussions that are going to happen. So two of the ones that I'd like to highlight is being able to maintain confidentiality, and that's number 10. And the idea is not to repeat people's names or what you heard, but when you do share with other people, to be able to talk about something that you actually learned from the space, right? And the other one that I wanted to make mention of was number 6, which is self-care is radical love. Since these conversations may present triggers or you may feel some type of way about it, being also able to kind of step away, take a breath, turn off your camera if you need to have a moment to yourself and come back when you're ready, right? John, what were some of the ones that you wanted to highlight in today's conversation?
So I really wanted to highlight first number 3, that we want to assume best intentions. We are here in the space to grow. When we have our discussion, there may be some subjects that we speak on that may be triggering for some people, that may be difficult to talk about, but we're talking about them with best intentions. I also wanted to speak on number 13, disagree and commit, because we may not all agree on some of those conversations. And we don't want to find ourselves in a situation where we are stuck on it, because we want to make sure that we're having that growth mindset and moving forward with understanding that that may be the case.
Sure. Is there any other thoughts or suggestions or any that you feel that are missing that folks in the room would like to make mention of before we decide to move on? Okay, if we hear none, let's get started in our conversation with learning objectives for today's. Next slide.
So our objectives for today are to identify the challenges that we face, that neurodivergent LGBT youth face, and discuss potential coping strategies and support resources. We want to talk about what that intersection looks like, what kind of stereotypes can come up, and personal biases, and how we can work on inclusive practices, as well as speak about community resources that can meet both of those groups' needs. And then further on at the end of the discussion, we want to have an open panel where we can kind of discuss experiences, personal insights, and our community needs.
All right, next slide. So many in this room have heard of what neurodivergency is, but the reality is it's a lot of things. So we wanted to kind of go through a definition of what it means. And it actually refers to the variations in the human brain. So regarding sociability, learning, attention, mood, and other mental functions. And it's a natural part of human diversity. It's not seen as a deficiency or a disorder. And that's something that we're going to expand on in a little bit, because sometimes that's the mindset that we hear about it in mainstream like society and media and conversation. And then what does it encompass? So as you can see in this chart, it's several things, right? From ADHD all the way to sensory processing disorder, Tourette syndrome, traumatic brain injury. So any neurocognitive profile that differs what would be considered neurotypical, right? And John, we were having a conversation the other day, no? About some of the additions.
So there are several conversations that could be had about what neurodiversity is. It's not just ADHD. You could have, so, sorry, excuse me. So we did speak previously about how neurodiversity and neurodivergence can also include things like mental health, depression, and anxiety, and understanding that there needs to be a space for that. And that the umbrella of a disability, we call it a disability, and the legal term is disability, that can include much more. So those mental health conditions, it can also, and I have seen this personally recently. I don't know exactly on the legal side what the specifics of it are, but I've even seen recently that like substance issues can be classified as a mental health issue. And I think that that's something that we should talk about because of the fact that in the LGBTQ communities and neurodivergent communities, they are much more at risk of developing those kinds of concerns. And so I think that's something that should be talked about because there needs to be holistic support for people that have this intersection to make sure that they are living the best lives they can.
So let's move on to the next slide. John, did you want to go into the infinite diversity and infinite combinations?
Yes. So one thing that I want to expand upon is the idea that this intersection of identities can have infinite diversity and infinite combinations. A lot of the time when people think about for instance, the autism spectrum, a common misconception is that that spectrum is a line and that you're on one side of it or the other, or that you're gay or straight or bi, and that it's not that you land somewhere on a line. And I think it's very important for us to understand that they're more like a cloud or a sphere, and that you can land anywhere within those identities. For instance, somebody who is neurodivergent, they may have traits of autism, and maybe they don't struggle as much with social issues, but they have very strong personal interests that they focus on, or they struggle in other places, and that we make sure that we're not putting them into small of a box or putting them in a box at all.
Heard this idea of like a cookie cutter solution or a cookie cutter remedy or resource. I think that's powerful. If we can go back just one slide so we can talk a little bit more about neuroqueer. So for those that haven't heard the term neuroqueer, as you see in the chart, the idea is that you have neurodiversity on one side, you have your queerness on one, and that's the blending of both that they overlap, right? So both neurodivergency and your LGBTQ identities, they not only challenge societal norms and expectations, but it's the idea that we're understanding that both spectrums can lead to more inclusive and supportive environments. As I was preparing this workshop, I went down a whole rabbit hole of this amazing information when it comes to specifically neuroqueer, and it's been a word that's been, ¿cómo se dice? It's been, we'll say that sometimes the word queer, folks, our older population have difficulty with it, obviously, because it came from a framework of right, where it was used in a derogatory way. But I have realized that a lot of our younger generations have definitely embraced that, and it also allows for conversation. So being able to use these two terms simultaneously, it allows for more individuals to feel together and feel like it's a strength, and it brings spaces for not only creative thinking, but hyper focus and pattern recognition. And I think it also brings space to be able to present challenges, right? In a space where we kind of just, other folks are kind of like what John was mentioning, that it isn't just linear, it's more of a sphere because you encompass all these different intersections, even outside of that, right? I think it's an understanding that neurodiversity is also ever evolving, right? And it can take on various traits. So I think being able to express lived experience, like we're going to be talking about in a little bit, of our neurodivergent individuals and what that looks like. I know when John and I were talking, I was diagnosed as an older adult with ADHD, and they were diagnosed as a youth, and how different that experience was and some of the things that they had to face. And I come in my experience, it's more of like reflecting back and being like, oh, that's why this didn't make sense, or that's why I was in this space. And it's different for everybody. So being able to share different experiences allows you to realize that you're not alone in these spaces. So I appreciated the term neuroqueer to be able to encapsulate that. So if we can move on to our next slide in regards to the journey is different from everybody. So as I mentioned, everybody's individual combination of neurodivergent traits and LGBTQ identities can be different, and it can also change, right? I think the timeline of being able to discover and understand these aspects varies, right, throughout the span of youth into, like our friend said, working adults or working young folks, and then turning into adults and then turning into elders. And there's no right order in what that looks like, right, for oneself. I think being able to talk about how intersectionality and environmental factors play a role, right? In the conversation that we were having with, I was having with John in regards to their school experience. So from academia all the way to getting into the workforce, thinking about cultural backgrounds and family dynamics and what that looks like as far as being able to access resources, right? As well as coping strategies and how those can change over time. I think it's important to be able to recognize each individual path and how it contributes to our rich diversity in our community, and be able to realize that all journeys are valid and worthy of celebration, right? So John, let's go into being able to define what neurodivergency is and what it isn't. Next slide.
Absolutely. So we all tend to have preconceptions about what neurodivergence is. I've had them. And I think it's very important to understand that neurodivergence is not a choice. It is not something that you do. It is not something that you can change. It's something that happens naturally. It's something that is a piece of who you are. It's a difference in the physiological and mental responses that you have to things compared to the majority of people. And it's an integral part of who you are, and it shapes the experiences that you have and the perspectives that you have. It's not just something that's quirky, but it's also not necessarily a deficiency. I think a lot of the conversation around ADHD and autism and other neurodivergencies is that there's something wrong with these people. There's something wrong with whatever they have going on, and that is not the truth. So for me, for example, I even got caught up in this looking at my own self. I got caught up in the idea that there was something wrong, that there was something, that there were things that I could not do. But the truth is that I just see the world differently. It's a different way of processing information. I make connections that no one else does. And my ADHD is not a personal failing. It's not something that needs to be fixed or cured. But it does make it difficult for me to operate in the world we live in at times. So that's the big takeaway, is understanding that somebody's neurodivergence is not something wrong with them. It's something that can make it difficult for them to operate in the world that we currently live in. The world is what we need to change, not that. And that's kind of why we say it requires understanding and accommodation, because it is considered a disability simply because of the society that we live in. An aspect of diversity that contributes to our experiences, but that most of the time our society doesn't support.
Yeah. All right, so now let's discuss the different challenges that folks face in these spaces. Next slide. So some of those harmful misconceptions and stereotypes, right, are assumptions on promiscuity, deviance, gender roles in relationships, And it's also an oversimplification of conditions like ADHD, autism, and mental illness. And what are those impacts? I think that these misconceptions not only lead to discrimination, internalized stigma, and barriers to acceptance. Can you talk, John, a little bit more about how diagnosis can be seen?
So, yes, so a diagnosis of a disability, I think you spoke earlier about how you were diagnosed as an adult, and that kind of led you to understanding, okay, this is an experience that I've had. So, okay, maybe that's why. As a young person who was diagnosed with ADHD in my very earliest years in kindergarten, I had a very big challenge to overcome the preconception that there were things I wouldn't be able to do. And that's something that stuck with me into my adulthood for a very long time. When young people are bombarded with this idea that they have a disability, it can at times wedge itself into their self-perception. And that prevents them from doing the things that they can do at times simply because of that messaging. And I think it's very important that the conversation around a diagnosis changes to an idea that diagnosis is a tool, because a diagnosis is a tool that we should be using to help them understand how to get through the society we live in with their diagnosis, rather than that there is something that they need to overcome and that there's something wrong with them. Medication can be a tool, but it shouldn't be a crutch. I think the conversation around neurodivergence needs to change to a conversation of how can we support them in building life skills first? How can we support them in building coping mechanisms for themselves independently of treatment first? Because and this is coming obviously through my own lens of life, but my experience was that I leaned on my medication, and that's what I thought was supposed to get me to where I was. And so then when I became an adult, I didn't have coping mechanisms. And so that's why I really think that holistic care and understanding that we have that conversation about what that means to have a disability is so important. It also can tend to, and I think that for a lot of people, there are barriers to getting that kind of care that need to be addressed. For me, as a young person, my healthcare was managed by my parents, and that is the case for most young people. Now, in most households, well, I can't even say most households, but in many households, that's fine. But for me, it was not. I grew up in a household with parents that did not know how to handle my ADHD to begin with. And so then when the conversation of me being gay came up, that situation got much, much more complicated. And I think it's very important we also speak to having support for young people from both sides. Because I started making connections and having those conversations in places that I shouldn't have. And I think that part of supporting our young people is making sure that they have the right conditions for them to succeed. Gabriella?
Yeah, I think you make a powerful point as far as making sure that caregivers and support systems and organizations that our youth engage with have those resources and tools to be able to support our youth to the best of their ability. Can you tell me a little bit about how the exacerbation of your mental health and just growing up and how that showed up in spaces for you?
So for me, that really showed up it took a very long time for me to break through the negative influences that I had from that experience. I already had parents that didn't know how to deal with me. And so then when it came up that I was LGBT, it just got worse. My self, I sort of attached my self-worth to my productivity, because that was the only thing I thought I was good at, was being in school. That was like the one thing I was good at, was remembering information and regurgitating it in testing. But if the people and the spaces that I was in were more attentive to the fact that I was more than just a student, I may have had better outcomes. And I think that our education system, as it is, has this really unfortunate tendency to focus on get good grades. You want to go to college, you want to do this, you want to be a great student. And and students that are neurodiverse and LGBT and don't necessarily know how to speak up and don't have those formational ability from the get-go to say, like, this is what I want, they have a really strong tendency to just kind of get lost in that. At least that's been my experience, because it took me until my adult life to figure out what I wanted for myself, because nobody ever asked me and I was too timid to say it, to even try to figure it out. My mental health had been a wreck for a very long time, until recently, when I started to access counseling on my own, and started to access spaces that are supportive. I will say that college has been a great experience for me. It has been a supportive experience, and it has put me in a position to break some of those chains.
Yes.
But in high school situations, and I know this is very difficult, especially with some of the legal concerns recently that we've been experiencing in our climate, especially in Florida. But I cannot say that I had the right support in primary school to get me anywhere close to being a functional adult.
So we need to make sure that we have better earlier interventions and supports to be able to mitigate those acts and problems. So,
Right, and I think peer
so next
support,
slide.
I think having peer support and things of that nature would be helpful as well, from
To
people
be
that have
able to
kind of
lean in
been
on
through it.
others that are your age range.
That, as well as maybe like supervised groups with people that are maybe a little bit in their future, right? To say, like, okay, this is what I experienced. This is something that may help you.
Heard. Thank you for sharing that, John. So how do we create more welcoming spaces in our different environments, right? So some of the things that we spoke about was organizational inclusivity, right? Being able to implement sensory-friendly environments and diverse communication formatting. Being able to train staff, right, on the variations of neurodiversity and LGBTQ issues, right? As well as being able to talk to our funders to be able to expand accessibility and resources. And that can look like something as easy as, instead of having a written format, maybe having a video format. I know, at least in my spaces, that's something that I've been able to vocalize out to different funders and organizations, is being able to implement other models that other organizations have done or other funders have done to be able to have better accessibility in that. John, how about when it comes to education and stigma reduction?
So I would say in education and stigma reduction, there are a lot of ways that that can manifest, right? So you have within young people's peer groups, there's going to be a stigma that, okay, they have some kind of issue, and that can distance students from their peers. So I think having some kind of way to connect those students with peers that are similar to them, maybe have some similar interests and similar concerns, is important, because you can't necessarily change how kids are going to behave. Kids are mean. Kids can be mean. But if you're able to get those students into groups where they are able to connect with people that are like them, that does great things for their future outcomes. And in terms of the stigma, that also extends to the educators, right? You have old ways of thinking that can get caught up in our education system. For instance, like the idea that somebody that's ADHD, they can't sit still. They may have difficulty sitting still, but if you give them the right sort of work to work on, they can focus on it for hours at a time. It's the difference between some kind of like interactive math problem, or where it's a little gamified, or doing like a sheet of paper that's this long, and then they can't sit and focus on it for 4 hours. I think that's very important. I think it's important to train staff on those issues and how to identify them. So it's also important to identify those problems and how they can affect students. For me, part of my experience was that, yes, I was neurodivergent, but everybody kind of forgot about that because I did so well in school. And I think that's a very important conversation to have. Just because a student is doing well academically does not mean that they are doing well personally, socially, or in any other aspect. And I think that's something that we fail to pay attention to sometimes in our education system. Academics are not a good indicator generally for how well a student is doing in their personal life, or even how prepared they are to move into having responsibilities as an adult.
So that kind of expands.
So I think developing, yes.
What were you saying?
Go ahead.
Sorry.
I think developing a toolkit to identify our neurodivergent and LGBT youth and kind of find out who they are and support them is a great way to start.
Excellent. I think you mentioned, as well as being able to like create those safe spaces amongst peers, you also mentioned, I think it was like counseling and other mentorship programs or support, so that they could then see themselves reflected in other individuals that have kind of gone through those similar experiences.
Exactly. Having those counseling and mentorship programs so that maybe those maladaptive thought patterns don't settle themselves in. We can catch them before they become a problem and get those students back on a path of growth. Because what that also leads into is like some severe traumas that can come up, and those can stall a student. Those can stall development. When you get traumatized in the ways that happen with those intersections, sometimes it can stall development, and people tend to retract. And a lot of the time with neurodivergence, people are already a little bit more isolated.
So that kind of goes into being able to have flexibility in whatever participation methods that are created, right? Whether that be in person, online, one-on-ones. You kind of have to ask questions and kind of read the space. I think it's also important to be able to respect individual preferences, right? Identity first language, if it's preferred, and being able to have a structured environment with sensory accommodations in space as well. Were there any other thoughts that you want to mention, John, before we get into our open discussion that maybe we didn't cover?
I think we could move on to the next section for it.
Yeah, okay. All right, so this is where we have our open discussion. I know that we're going to stop recording, I believe, yes.
Is that accurate?
I'll let our friends on the other side let us know. Ming or Janine?
Yeah, we'll go ahead and stop recording.
Channel. And interpreters, will you interpret in the Spanish channel?
All right. I wanted to make mention of some resources that are available to be able to support you, whether as a youth or an organization or a caregiver. So first and foremost, don't assume that you know everything, right? Remain open to being able to learn and to lean on others and be able to challenge yourself to discover new information and support systems. So Kaleidoscope is a online platform that provides information on the intersections of autism and LGBTQ identities. They also provide a list of other resources that are not only national, but on a local level, and it's sectioned off by state. So that provides an amazing platform. They also do have support groups. We have the Trevor Project, which offers crisis intervention and suicide prevention services. And they also have resources for LGBTQ youth, also those that sit at the intersection of neurodivergent. Another one that's not on here is the Asperger Autism Network and LGBTQ support groups. And they offer support groups for those that sit at the intersection of autistic and LGBTQ. You also have the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network that works more with creating safer schools for our LGBTQ youth. And they also offer targeted information when it comes to our neurodivergent youth when it comes to educational settings. Neuroqueer was the platform that I had mentioned earlier in the conversation, and that's an online community and resource hub for our youth. And then PFLAG. So PFLAG is more for caregivers and educators, and that's also a space for support groups and resources for our youth and their families. And then lastly, we have the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, which also provides information with those that sit at the intersection of autistic and LGBTQ. Were there any other ones that we wanted to make mention of, John, that aren't listed here?
I don't know if we spoke about this, but specifically for Central Florida, there's the center on Mills. They do a lot of great work, and they have a lot of resources that are available for LGBTQ individuals. But beyond that,
the one right next to the center, I'm trying to think of it off the top of my head, that focuses on youth. Zebra Coalition.
yes, the Zebra Coalition is fantastic. They have lots of programs that allow young people to get housing and health and care if they don't have that available from a family or whatever other resources that may be available.
So we ask you to go back to your spaces and your organizations and kind of do a deeper dive when it comes to looking for resources, so that when we do have youth in our space or caregivers and educators, we can be better equipped, right? So this ends today's conversation, but I wanted to go to the next slide and provide you some reads. These are some amazing articles and books that you are able to pull from. And like we mentioned, you're also able to reach out to us if you have any other questions or if you want to continue this conversation. We would be open to it. And lastly, next slide. These are some effective accommodations for individuals who identify as neurodivergent, and some tools that folks in the room can take with them today as well. All right, last slide. I think after that is our information and contacts. We thank everybody for being in this space today, having conversation with us, and taking the time to speak to us today on what it is to be neurodiverse and an LGBTQ youth. We hope you have a wonderful evening. Thank you.
Thank you both so much for the presentation and for talking us through everything. It was really interesting to hear about.
Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely.
Thank you to both of you. Thank you, Gabriella, for doing a presentation while on the road. I can't imagine how tough that was. And just to share, our next session for the summit is going to be tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. It'll be a new Zoom link, which we will send out if you were registered. You'll get a copy of that link, and it's going to be on HIV prevention and treatment in